If you have a production website and you're not using analytics, you're missing out on capturing a ton of information about your site. Things like how someone found your site, which pages users land on your site, which pages get the most views, aspects of your site that your users are interested in. For example, a certain document download, like a wine list for a restaurant or a case study your company has performed. You can also compare how changes to your site affect your usage, for good or for bad. So now we understand why we should have analytics. Let's go and add Google Tag Manager to our Nuxt3 website. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel, or welcome back if you're following along as we go through some of this. So today we're adding Google Tag Manager into our Nuxt3 website. So I've got the site open here, and the first thing we're going to do is add in the necessary package that we need. So we're going to use the GTM support Vue.js package. So let's go and install that, which is just a standard Vue package to enable Google Tag Manager for Vue. So given that, we are going to create a plugin in our Nuxt app. So let's go and create a Vue GTM, and we only want it running on the client side. So we'll put the .client in so that Nuxt knows about that. And this plugin is how we wire the Vue GTM plugin into Nuxt. So we're going to import the create GTM method or function from the package that we just imported, and then, as we always have with our Nuxt plugins, we define our Nuxt plugin, and then to add in a Vue plugin we use the Vue use method, and then inside that we can call the create GTM. And then in here what we need is a few things. We first of all need the ID of our Google Tag Manager instance. What I've got over here is I'm logged into my Google Tag Manager account, and you get this container ID when you set this up. I did a previous video around setting up Google Tag Manager with Nuxt2, so all of where this is created can be found in that video if you want to go back to that one and follow that along. But essentially, once you've set up a Google Tag Manager site in here, you get this container ID, and that's what you need to copy across into the ID property over here. There's a few other properties which I'll just paste in for brevity here and then run through them. So the important one here is the Vue router one, which we need to hook into the Nuxt router. So we can do that using the Nuxt composable use router, and that ties this plugin into the Vue router so that every time you navigate between pages, it's essentially hooked into the Google Tag Management, and it will send a page view. The other properties that we've got, so we're enabling this. We're saying yes, we want this to be enabled. We're saying that we do want debug trace, so we want to be able to see in our browser window what's going on with the Google Tag Manager plugin. In production, you probably want to turn this off, and we'll get to how we can tie this in with our environment settings in a while. So let's save that out and run up our site. So our site is running, and we can see now that we're getting this trace coming out for GTM support, and it's giving us a page view essentially. So it's telling us what the URL was that was called. So as I navigate around my site, I just collapse that back down, we'll see that I get another track view there for my team. And when I come over to the contact us page, I get a track view for that as well. So it is correctly wired in, and as I'm navigating around my site, I'm getting the page views coming up. So if I disable the debug trace here, which is what you'd obviously want in production, then we can see that the debug trace disappears. We don't get any trace coming out in the logs. And then we can see if I set enabled to false, so if I disable the plugin but re-enable the debug trace, I do actually still get a trace, but it's telling me that the GTM plugin is actually disabled, which means that this won't actually be sent across to Google Tag Manager. It's only running locally within the browser, but not actually forwarding those events. So to actually get proper trace inside of Google Tag Manager, we need to have enabled set to true, which we'll get to in a bit. So it's obviously not very useful to have to embed some of these settings. So whether it's enabled, whether we want debug trace, and what the ID might be. We don't want that hard coded. We want that to be able to be configured per environment. So we might have a different debug or development Google Tag Manager instance than we do for our production site, for instance. So we need to extract some of these properties out into our environment settings. So I've got a video on setting up environment settings that goes through how we've arrived at this file. So we can now leverage this to add in some extra properties. So I can put in the Google Tag Manager key and whether I want it enabled and whether I want debug. And I can do that for my development environment as well as a staging site as well as a production site. So I can use that, and let's just go through. And so for debug, I do want that enabled. For staging, I do want that enabled, but I don't want any debug trace in that one. You could set this to some dummy value here so that you disable this in development if that's what you want. So that shows you how you can set some of those settings, and then with those in place we can come over to our Nuxt config and we can come down to our runtime config, which is where we get our settings, and we can put in some new properties. So for a Google Tag Manager ID, I'm pulling out the global settings based on the environment that we're running in and getting that Google Tag Manager key, and likewise for the enabled and the debug. So that gets me some extra properties inside the runtime config. And then if I come back over to the plugin to utilize that runtime config and get those values, we can use runtime config composable, get the public area. If you see, it's inside the public object. So that gets us an object here that points to that configuration area. And then we can change the ID. Instead of using a hard coded value, we can use that runtime config and get the GTM ID out. So it's referencing that particular property there. And we can do the same for the debug and the enabled as well. So that's got us wired up for running in any given environment, but it's not really enough just to enable this or be able to wire this up to Google Tag Manager. Google uses cookies, and in certain countries like the UK where I am, we have to worry about cookie consent. So we have GDPR requirements. So we have to try and wire this into our cookie consent. We can only start sending data to Google Tag Manager once we've got consent from the user that they're happy for us to use that particular category of cookie. So they're happy for us to capture their page views and marketing level information. So they can opt out of that if they want to. So how do we wire that up? In our particular case, we've got our cookie consent module and plugin that we've got wired into our Nuxt application, and I've got a previous video on that about how we go about wiring in this cookie consent. So we've got our cookie consent configuration here. So these are our necessary cookies. These are the ones that the users have to agree with because our site can't work without it. But what we can do is add in an optional section, and we can put in a section for some marketing cookies and say that these are used for Google Analytics, and these are the cookies that will actually get added into your browser. So the GA and the token. So that's the ID that will be used to store any preferences that you have for Google Analytics. So we can add that in, and we need to remember that we've called it marketing. That's the key point of information here. So then we can jump over to the plugin again, and I'm going to move that inside there, starters, and then we can get hold of our cookie consent object from the Nuxt application, which we've plugged in previously using the cookie consent module. And we can also add a constant for that marketing cookie group, which gets lowercased by the cookie consent plugin. And then we can change the enabled to not only take account of the runtime config property, but we can also get it to call into the cookie consent is enabled function, which allows you to query whether or not a particular category of cookie is enabled. So we can query whether the marketing group is enabled or not. We can save that out, and then we can come over to our site. We can clear out all of our cookies, refresh our site, and then we can go into the manage cookies. We see our marketing and that we've enabled it, and in this case we are going to enable it. And when we save that, we see the cookie control gets enabled and the marketing group is there, and you can see that there is a track view at that point for the main page, and we see that the Google Analytics cookies get enabled, which is what we warned the user would happen if they accept our marketing cookies. So now I can use the site as I would do, and as I navigate around I get screen names. And if I just go back and refresh that, and I manage the cookies but then disable the marketing cookie, we see that I get the cookie consent, but as I navigate around, Google Analytics is not enabled. So it's taking account of the cookie consent before it's enabling Google Analytics. We can see it's disabled here, which is exactly what we would hope for. So that's good. But there is a slight wrinkle in paradise at this point. So if I just refresh the page again, when I'm accepting and saving the cookie consent causes a reload on the page to happen. Whereas if I just accept all, then there is no page reload, and as I navigate around the site, the cookie consent has been enabled, but the plugin has already been enabled, so the Google consent or the Google plugin is still thinking that it should be disabled, when in actual fact the user has accepted everything. So how do we deal with that scenario? So inside of the layout that we're using, which is where the cookie consent lives, we actually have a cookies accepted method that can be called, or an event that comes back from our cookie consent when cookies are accepted. And at the moment we've got that wired up in here to call this particular method, and as you can see it passes you in the group. So we can use this now to our advantage, so that when this gets fired, which is where this log came from over here, so we can see cookies accepted, and it's fired twice, once for the essential cookies and once for our marketing. So inside here, all we've got to do is check if the group that's being consented to is the marketing group, then we can go and enable the cookies. So we can add in our constant again for the marketing, and we can see from our log that the name is uppercase marketing, and then we can check if the incoming group dot name equals marketing, then we'll go and enable the Google Tag Manager. Now we've got to go and create this Google Tag Manager and be able to get access to it. So we'll leave this here for now, and what we'll do is we'll go and create a composable to enable us to be able to access easily the Google Tag Manager across our application. So let's go and create that composable. So inside there we'll have a composable called use GTM, and we will import the use GTM from our GTM plugin that we added at the start, and we're going to rename it here just to avoid confusion, because we want our particular composable to be called use GTM as well, so that's why we're renaming it. So let's just put the rest of the code in here, and then you'll see why this makes sense. So we're going to expose a composable called use GTM, and we are going to set that to the use Vue GTM from the plugin. So we're essentially just exposing out the object that is used inside of the Vue GTM plugin globally inside of our application. So with that composable in place, it means we can come back over to our layout, and inside of our layout we can actually get hold of the GTM object using that use GTM composable that we just created, and now everything is great, and we can just call the enable on that GTM object. So if we get the marketing consent, then we can enable GTM this way. So let's go back and retest that scenario. Let's get rid of all of our cookies. Let's refresh our site. We get our cookie consent dialog pop up and we accept all. And now if I navigate around, I get that GTM is enabled, and we see our Google Tag Manager cookies are now enabled correctly, even though I didn't do a full site reload. So that gets us page views, but we also need to worry about certain events on our site. So as I said at the start, you might be interested in certain downloads. Maybe you're a restaurant and you want to know how many times your menu gets downloaded, for instance, or you've got a contact page and you want to know how many times someone has actually gone and tried to contact you. So we've got a contact page on our site, so we can go and wire in some analytics into the actual send button on there so that we get some analytics every time the user clicks that send button. So let's go and have a look at how we can do that. So over in the contact page, inside of our JavaScript in our setup function, the first thing we can do is use our composable again to get hold of our Google Tag Manager object. And then down in our submit form method, which is the method that gets called when that button gets clicked, we can go and leverage some functionality of the Google Tag Manager plugin itself. So where should we do it? Before we actually make the call, we can call a Google Tag Manager track event method, and inside there we can send it an object which has an event property, which we can set in this case to form submitted, which is what we did in our previous video for Nuxt2. So we'll use the same event name so that it gets captured in the same tag as we've previously set up. We'll see that in a bit, and we'll send it the actual form that's being submitted. So in our case it's our contact us form. And again, we've set this up previously inside Google Tag Manager. I'll show that in a bit. And that's it. So that's how you can set up Google Tag Manager to actually track an event on things like a button click or some kind of download anchor or something like that inside your JavaScript. It's just a case of calling the track event with the correctly named event. So with that in place, let's now jump over to Google Tag Manager itself, and let's go and just do a quick recap. So you can see here that I've got the tags set up for form submit and form submit failure. So form submit was the one that we just did on the contact form. And I've also got a general Google Analytics configuration that is currently triggering on a Nuxt page view, which is a Nuxt2 event. So we need to wire this up now to Nuxt3 so that we capture these events. So the easiest way to see what events are being fired is to preview your site. So we click on preview and we'll go to localhost 3000 main page and connect up to that. So there's our website up and running, and Google Tag Manager tells us that we are connected, so we can continue in there and we can start to see the events that are being fired in. So I'm on the home page and I've obviously consented to Google Tag Manager at this point. So now when I click onto a page, you can see that events are popping in here. So I'm getting this content view. So that's the actual event that is coming in, is a content view. So that's what we need to capture, and we can see at the moment that it's not firing any tags, but we would want a page view to fire into Google Analytics. So how do we go and add that in? So let's close some of this off and come back to our Google Tag Manager configuration. And what we need is a new trigger. So inside here, we can create a new trigger and we can call it something appropriate like a Nuxt3 page view. And we go to custom event, and inside the custom event, we use content view. So we can save that. And now we've got our Nuxt3 trigger, which at the moment says it isn't being used, but we can jump back over to the tags and go to the Google Analytics configuration. And the triggering at the moment is set up for Nuxt2, but we can easily just go and add that in with a Nuxt3 page trigger. So we'll save that, and let's go and preview again our site. So localhost main page and navigate, and I get a content view, and now I can see that my Google Analytics configuration is being triggered. So every time I navigate around the site now, I'm actually firing events into Google Analytics, and the data that I'm firing into Google Analytics shows me the page that's been clicked. So I can see where users are navigating around my site, which is useful stuff. And then onto the contact page. So if I just put in some dummy data in here and send that in, we can see that I get my form submitted as I did with Nuxt2, and the form submitted that's coming in tells us what the actual form that was submitted. So again, it's the contact us form. So that's how we can wire up Google Tag Manager in with Google Analytics and easily wire that up with our Nuxt application for either page views or custom events. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you find that useful. And if you did, then please let me know in the comments, and do like and subscribe to the channel for more tips and tricks and tutorials like this. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.